So the study I am about to present to you is one that was conducted by 3 researchers, and their names are listed here: Alejandro Drexler, Fischer, and Antoinette Schoar. They aren't able to be here at the conference today, so I'm going to present their study on their behalf. But this is a study that was conducted a few years ago and is quite mature, so it'll be lovely to have a discussion of learnings from it. The other 2 studies were quite recent. But my name is Aishwarya, and I work for Innovations for Poverty Action. I lead the Global Financial Inclusion Initiative, and again, very happy that everybody's here to discuss these topics. All right, so to get into it, so this is basically what this entire study is about. So sometimes it's not necessary, or it can actually be harmful to do too much. So sometimes less can be more. And I'm guessing this is the principle on which Apple sold us everything they've ever sold us. It seems to work. And there are different ways, I think even culturally, if you go back in time, there are lots of things which you do. Like, for example, when I think about this, I think, why am I taking my shoes off before I go into my house? And it is a heuristic, it's a rule of thumb, you know, so that we don't infect our houses. But you do it out of habit, but a lot of what we do comes from these small insights that turn into regular behaviors. So, what is the problem that we're after? You've had a wonderful introduction to it, so I won't say much more, except to say that there's a certain amount of complexity involved in some of these decisions that we make every day, whether as household members or whether as people trying to run these enterprises. So for example, do you know exactly how much you should be saving for your retirement? I do not, for sure. For micro entrepreneurs, they have to face pretty challenging questions like, how much should I invest? Do I know what my returns are? What are my profits? And as you've heard, there's well-documented evidence that most people find it extremely hard to get these numbers right and to take financial decisions on the basis of this information. And there's evidence from the US, from India, Indonesia, and other places. And again, there seems to be a strong link in other studies that trace sort of the understanding of financial concepts through the ability to make better financial decisions, and finally, to improvements in household well-being. And part of this relates to the keynote speech that you heard this morning from Abhijit Banerjee, in thinking about what is the policy discourse for some of these discussions, right? So when we went in, maybe for a few years, there was a prevalent understanding that these skills already exist, that people who are currently in businesses know how to run them optimally. But I think the experience of the past decades has sort of revealed that maybe these assumptions were assumptions. They weren't actually borne out by evidence and measurement. And the recent impact evaluations of microcredit programs have come up with a set of results that are very compelling in this regard, that there are certainly skills required to run micro enterprises, and these are not uniformly distributed. But also that managerial capital is distinct from just being good. It takes a very specific kind of talent to run a good enterprise. And all of us know this intuitively, but I think it's good to see the measurements bear it out. So, what are some of these key unknowns? Whether and how can such skills, such financial literacy skills be taught? Can they be taught? What's the best way to teach them? And is there a causal link between providing this kind of education and household outcomes or enterprise outcomes? So in terms of what we know already, based on sort of the traditional models of financial education, whether it's in a classroom, whether you bring people together for these discussions, we have very, very mixed evidence on what's working and how much it's working and for whom it's working. So large variations in the kind of impact, but these are also being questioned from a pragmatic perspective because they're very expensive to conduct. So is this the right model that we should be going after? But it seems like there are a lot of questions that we could do well to answer in order to improve the ways we think about delivering financial education. So first, who are coming to these training programs? Just from the previous session. Is there self-selection into it based on some characteristics that, once we identify them, we can do better. What methodologies, are particularly effective in conveying information? This has been the big question in education for centuries. How do I get people to understand what I'm saying and retain it for more than like the next 5 minutes? And how technical or complex does this information delivery need to be, or can it actually ride on ways people actually learn from the world? And the one I missed here is, how does knowledge improve, but how does the knowledge also translate into actions and behavior, which is something that the previous session also called our attention to. So the particular study we'll be talking about is based in the Dominican Republic. And here we were looking at 2 sets of questions. First, can financial literacy training improve both business and individual outcomes for micro-entrepreneurs? So a very specific kind of client. And what is the trade-off between a financial education program that is traditional, principles-based, teaches you about accounting, versus something that's a little more heuristics-based? So something that teaches you simple rules of thumb, ways to go about doing things which are beneficial for you. Yeah? So our partner is in the room. So Mercedes is sitting here, but she will also discuss her thoughts on this in the next panel. But this was a study with ADOPEM, a very large savings and credit bank in the DR. And right now, ADOPEM, I think, has about 145,000 active borrowers. This was what we found recently, but at that point in time, it had about 60,000 clients in 2006 when the study started. And just to give you a sense of what the environment looked like then, about 90% of loans were for fairly small amounts, starting at the lower end at $70, but going all the way to about $1,400. And about 44% of their loan portfolio went to group lending, of which most of the clients were women. And so ADOPEM was conducting a number of training programs, and they were very interested to see which was working well and which could be improved. And they already sort of had a sense that people who do come to these programs are different, in certain ways. They are selecting themselves into coming to these programs, so they wanted to also find out, as part of the evaluation of the financial literacy training, if this was true, and if so, what were the characteristics of the people who opted to go for trainings. So the test actually involved comparing 2 different ways of doing financial literacy training. So here you have the standard principles-based accounting. This is similar to programs that are run by large organizations like Freedom from Hunger, the ILO, BRAC, and others to teach financial literacy principles. So it involves some curricular items like daily record keeping of cash sales and expenses, your aggregation of your daily records for your microenterprise, calculating cash profits, working capital, inventory management, double entry accounts, accounts receivable, accounts payable, investment planning. These are all the words that we're all familiar with because of working with our finance departments. But as you can see, a fairly technical set of material to teach micro-entrepreneurs. The course ran for 3 days, 3 hours per session, and there was one session a week. And it ran for 6 weeks. In contrast, the research team with ADOPEM and with a number of trainers in the DR came up with a new curriculum, which was simpler. Right? And it's going on sort of the rules of thumb of how to get finances right or accounting right. So for example, these are not comprehensive lists, this is just a sampling. So one example is, just keep 2 different boxes for different expenses. Have a box that is for your household expenses and have a purse that is for your business expenses. Extremely simple, right? And much easier to implement. But it has a way of then tracking expenses that are just from one particular component of your sort of household plus enterprise financial system. Instead of working capital management, which may be complex, why don't you pay yourself a wage and include that in how you track the expenses? So you have a way of seeing that line item within all of your other expenses. When you transfer money between your household box and your enterprise box, issue an IOU. A stack of notes that said what went from where to where, and at the end of the day, end of the month, you're able to reconcile. And finally, instead of calculating revenues, just list everything that happens. And I found this to be a wonderful component. Just everything, write everything down. And the simple act of writing things down, I think even in psychology, has shown to have certain effects on what we are able to do with that information, just writing everything down. So this was for 3 hours per session, like the other treatment, a day a week, but only for 5 weeks. And so the study itself, what initially from the administrative data provided by the partner, about 1,200 clients were picked. So these were existing ADOPEM business or personal loan clients from Santo Domingo, and who had expressed some, interest earlier in potential trainings in the future. And in this group, we then took these 1193 folks and divided them up into 3 groups, again randomized, so that they were roughly comparable at the end. So about 402 folks were assigned to the standard accounting treatment, 404 people to the rules of thumb treatment, and another 387 were not given any training, and they served as the comparison group. The treatment or the training was provided at every individual's level. The courses were taught by local instructors who were well-versed in teaching to adults. There was a fee for the program that was charged, about $6, but it was randomized whether you had to pay a fee or whether you received a fee waiver or a stipend to attend. The overall program cost, though, was about $21, so it was a subsidized program. And again, in order to sort of think about, is it the fact that in a classroom we don't like asking questions, we don't like to follow up, is that part of the problem, and why people don't internalize new information? What they did was they randomly assigned half of the people in each treatment group to receive someone, to have a home visit. So after the training, they would have someone come home and just say, hey, did you understand everything? Do you have questions? I'm happy to sort of work with you in getting through the details. And this was, partly because you wanted to distinguish what was going wrong. At the end of the day, we do all of the study, and at the end, if we don't see that anything changed, we need to have a good way to understand what was it that was the problem, right? That's part of the learning. So if the training did not work, then now, because of the way the study is designed, you're able to say, was it because people didn't understand the content as part of the classroom training? Was it because they didn't understand in the classroom, but later on with the home visits, they were able to understand it, but they chose not to do anything about the new information? And finally, even when they understood the material, was it that, and they implemented it, but nothing changed, at the end of the day? So the data for the study itself came from the partner as well as from surveys. So if you look at the timeline, originally we selected the sample based on administrative records. Then you have a baseline survey that was conducted in 2006, and a couple of the variables that were sort of collected through the survey are listed here. So household and business characteristics, what are your business practices, business skills, your training history, your interest in future training, etc. The trainings were then conducted through 2007, and the end-line survey was conducted in 2008, 12 months after the trainings had finished. So you allow some time for people to actually put things into practice and then come back to them to say, hey, how, has anything, measured the same things that you did at baseline to see if anything's changed. And of course, this was augmented with some administrative data. So one thing to sort of state up front is even at baseline, self-reported data in terms of how people were managing their finances was quite high. And this, again, goes to the larger point that when you're asking people certain questions, the likelihood would be for them to give you responses that you want to hear as well. So this is a caution generally when you're asking about self-reported behaviors. But at baseline, about 74% of people reported that they were actually separating personal and business cash. About 66% said that they had actual accounting records. And then you can see some of the other items. And 80% said that they actually calculated their revenues formally, which seems like, which seems quite high, but you'll see later on how this changes with the study. In order to address this issue of self-reporting, one thing that the study did, which might be relevant for some of you who are on the practitioner side of this, is to come up with metrics that are slightly more objective in measuring, whether how people are behaving or how people are acting. And so they constructed this index of financial reporting errors. And this had particular components to it. So they marked a particular item as an error when it qualified either, when you listed a bad period sale that was either average or good, or an average period as being better than good. And at baseline, they found that about 45% of the people in the sample made at least one mistake, and 11% made more than 3 mistakes. So this was just looking at their record books to have a way of deciding what's the quality of financial reporting in this micro enterprise. All right. So a little bit on who are we talking about. The average person in the study was 40 years old, had 3 children. The loan size that she had was about $750. 90% of the sample were women. 35% had more than a high school degree, so many of them did not. And about 2/3 of them had some savings. The median borrower's average weekly revenues were about $85. And most of them were sole proprietorships, so no employees. And those who did have employees, most of them had 1 or 2 extra employees. So these are the kinds of stores. I hope you can see some of them. I learned recently that Colmado is the name specifically in the DR for these kinds of small shops, but a lot of small business owners. So the first thing to take away is attendance is not random, and this goes exactly in the direction of what the partner institution's intuition was. People self-select into these programs. Those who came to the training were more likely to be women, slightly better educated, have had some sort of prior training, and they wanted to have more training. They had smaller businesses, but they had large plans to grow these businesses. So this sounds a lot like somebody in Silicon Valley to me, like, you know, somebody who's like really wants to have their business expand and has the intentions to do it, but just looking for some sort of guidance along the way. So now for the actual results of the training. So the rules of thumb training systematically outperformed the traditional accounting training. So in the business practices index that was constructed, you saw about 1/4 of a standard deviation increase or improvement in business practices as a result of going through the rules of thumb training. And this is a very large effect size, again, going to the previous discussion that we had. So if you look at a couple of the components that go into the business practices index, separating cash between business and personal, keeping adequate records, separating your business and personal accounts, calculating revenues. This is the control group, yeah, in terms of where we start at. If you look at the standard accounting training, you don't see very much difference, even visually. And now if you look at the rules of thumb training in terms of the actual measures, you see an 8 percentage point increase in the separation of cash between business and personal. Similarly, 11 percentage points for keeping records, separating accounts, another 11 percentage point increase, and likewise. And this is significant at the 1% level. So these are very sort of strong, it's a very strong indication that these are actual effects and not because of just some measurement error. Also, the objective reporting index that was constructed, you saw a significant increase in the rules of thumb training, 8 percentage points, less likely to make such errors in financial reporting quality, no such effect for the standard accounting training, and business performance, which is what we care about sort of at the end of the day. You see a 0.1 standard deviation increase in the revenue index, which is a fairly powerful result, and especially during bad weeks. And you'll hear this again in some of the other studies, something about, you know, particularly bad periods for the business. The literacy program, especially through the rules of thumb training modules, seem to have an effect when things were going bad for the business. Yeah? Other kinds of outcomes that you might be interested in, which affect institutions, loan size, loan type, savings, or dropout rates, didn't change as a result of the intervention. And one of the interesting things from the study is that there was some amount of variation in who it affected more significantly, and what happened in the neighborhoods where this training was implemented, right? So the one takeaway from this is, if you could look to the bottom here, some of the improved sales in these particular businesses that went through the rules of thumb could actually have come from neighboring businesses losing a little bit of revenue. So this is important to keep in mind before we start thinking about scaling these programs. Like, what is happening to the other businesses? How much of this is new revenue? How much of it is just taking revenue from other folks? And the other thing is, in the rules of thumb training did especially well for those who came in with low levels of skill, low sort of quality of business practices, and low interest in attending the training itself. So this is interesting. If we just allowed people to self-select, then maybe we're not going to get the kinds of people who could benefit the most from these kinds of trainings. The follow-up visits didn't have very much effect for the rules of thumb training, but for the standard accounting training, there was some effect that was seen. So this goes to the point of, should we be matching people better? Certain kinds of people may be good for the sort of standard accounting. Certain kinds of people may find the rules of thumb training much better. All right, so in terms of what you should take away from this, first is that it's important to think very carefully about what we're delivering and how we're delivering it for it to be effective at all. So the traditional accounting training did not have any effects in this setting, but the easy to implement rules of thumb training actually had very important or significant effects on management practices and on business performance and revenues. It's also robust. It seems to work a lot or well for those who come in with lower levels of skill and interest, but we cannot make claims about global best practices because this is just one study in one location with one set of clients. And so the next steps basically involve thinking about this as a program. This is an idea. Think about how it can be applied to different settings in different locations. And this organization, Ideas 42, is specifically interested in rolling out rules of thumb-based interventions and seeing how they can be taken to scale. So feel free to contact Alex at this address, and I'm happy to share it with you afterwards if you're interested in this kind of program. Thank you for listening.